The Chinese president is setting an example when it comes to environmental protection by personally joining a tree planting in Beijing today.
When news first broke that China was dumping straw and planting millions of trees in its deserts, most of the world scoffed. Environmentalists warned it would flop, scientists called it a waste, and critics everywhere laughed. After all, who tries to plant a forest in the middle of a sandstorm? But a decade later, those same voices have gone silent and some are downright embarrassed. The Gobi Desert isn't just a little greener. What's happening there might change the way the entire world fights back against climate collapse. Are you ready for the biggest environmental twist you never saw coming? How China's land crisis turned into a national emergency. It's easy to forget just how fragile the world's largest countries can be. If you visited northern China in the early 2000s, you would have found a landscape at war with itself. The wind never stopped. Sometimes it arrived as a gentle, sand-laden whisper. Other days it screamed, ripping across half-barren steppe and farmland, carrying stinging dust for hundreds of kilometers until it finally rained down over Beijing, Seoul, even Tokyo. The deserts of northern China were growing at a rate that stunned scientists and terrified officials. The Gobi, that ancient sea of shifting dunes and stony barrens, was marching south and east by as much as 3,000 square kilometers every year. A pace so relentless that entire villages, highways, and even cities found themselves teetering on the edge of a new environmental abyss. But this wasn't some slow-moving tragedy. For the people who lived in the path of the encroaching sands, it was a disaster happening in real time. Parents sent their children to school wearing surgical masks and goggles, hoping to spare them from the suffocating sand. Farmers stood at the edge of their fields and watched as their crops withered, their wells dried up, and their homes slowly disappeared beneath ever-thickening blankets of dust. Some families, trapped between the relentless desert and bureaucratic indifference, finally gave up. They packed their belongings, abandoned their ancestral homes, and joined the ranks of China's ecological migrants, the first of their kind anywhere in the world, forced to move not by war, but by the planet itself turning against them. How did things get this bad? For much of the 20th century, China's rise was built on extracting as much as possible from the land, with little thought for long-term sustainability. In the years after the founding of the People's Republic, population exploded. Forests were cut to provide fuel and building material, leaving entire provinces stripped bare. The vast grasslands of Inner Mongolia, once green and full of life, became overgrazed by surging herds of livestock. The government pressed millions of farmers to reclaim every available patch of earth, often in places where topsoil was already thin and rainfall scarce. As more land was cleared for farming, the vegetation that held the sand in check disappeared. Strong winds, especially during the bone-dry spring, scoured the exposed soil and carried it away, turning fields into barren dust bowls. For a time, the disasters felt local, but by the 1970s and 80s, it was clear that China's north had become ground zero for one of the largest episodes of desertification in recorded history. By the year 2000, over 2.6 million square kilometers of land, more than a quarter of the entire country was considered degraded or at high risk of turning to desert. In the most affected regions, such as Inner Mongolia, Ningxia, Gansu, and Xinjiang, satellite imagery told a story of creeping loss. Green faded to yellow, yellow to brown, and brown to grey, until all that remained was shifting sand. The Taklamakan, known for centuries as the Sea of Death, was once again swallowing villages, trade routes, and roads that had survived since the Silk Road era. The effects rippled far beyond the desert's edge. Beijing, Tianjin, and other great northern cities found themselves bombarded each spring by dust storms so severe they turned day into night. The air choked with grit. Hospital admissions for respiratory problems soared. Sometimes the sandstorms grew so intense that particles crossed the Yellow Sea, turning the skies orange as far as South Korea and Japan. On rare occasions, scientists traced Chinese dust all the way across the Pacific, where it finally settled over San Francisco or Seattle. The human cost was staggering. It's estimated that as many as 400 million people lived in or near regions threatened by desertification. In bad years, millions were directly affected by sandstorms, losing crops, livestock, even entire homes. Wells ran dry, especially in places where groundwater was pumped recklessly to keep up with agricultural quotas. Farmers abandoned their fields. Small towns, once bustling with life, were reduced to dusty ghost villages, their residents forced into new cities or resettlement camps far from the only land they'd ever known. China became one of the first countries to officially recognize ecological migrants as a new kind of displaced population. Families uprooted not by war or politics, but by environmental collapse. The Gobi was no longer just a backdrop for epic tales. It was now on the move, a force threatening the very future of the nation. For China's government, the stakes went even deeper. In the early 2000s, the country was in the midst of an unprecedented economic boom. New highways, factories, and skyscrapers sprang up almost overnight. China was eager to present itself as a 21st century superpower, a master of technology and global trade. Yet behind the modern facade, the country was losing its battle against the ancient enemy of sand. Leaders in Beijing realized that unchecked desertification posed a direct threat to food security, economic stability, and even the legitimacy of the state itself. If the world's fastest-growing power couldn't protect its own land and people, what did that say about the promise of the Chinese dream? For years, the response had been a patchwork of local projects. Windbreaks here, irrigation channels there, small-scale replanting schemes that slowed but never stopped the advance of the desert. It became clear that these piecemeal efforts were not enough. A bold, national plan was needed, something big enough to match the scale of the crisis. Out of this desperation, the seeds of an audacious idea began to take root in the minds of Chinese planners and scientists. What if they could actually fight back against the desert? What if, instead of retreating, they could plant a literal wall of green, hundreds of kilometers of forests, shrubs, and grasses stretching across the northern third of the country? The concept sounded like a fantasy. A new Great Wall, not of stone but of living trees, that would stabilize the land, hold back the sand, and restore hope to the battered provinces of the north. The vision was staggering in scope. Planners imagined a shelter belt stretching over 4,500 kilometers in length and as much as 1,500 kilometers in width. The project would reclaim more than 35 million hectares of land, transforming barren stretches into thriving ecosystems. This green Great Wall would be a living monument to human resilience, a testament to the power of national mobilization and scientific innovation. But could such a scheme possibly succeed, especially in the face of mounting failures and international ridicule? Skeptics both inside and outside China were not shy about voicing their doubts. Foreign journalists derided the plan as burying money in the sand, and environmentalists warned that planting the wrong kinds of trees or planting anything at all without changing water management practices could actually make matters worse. Within China, some scientists pointed to the failures of past campaigns, arguing that the government's top-down, quota-driven approach was more about appearances than real ecological change. Local officials often cut corners to meet their tree-planting targets, resulting in monocultures that were vulnerable to pests, disease, and drought. In some places, planted forests died in droves, leaving behind eerie rows of dead trunks that served as monuments to well-intentioned but poorly executed ambition. Meanwhile, the desert pressed on. As each year passed, more land was lost, and more families abandoned hope of ever returning home. Yet, for all the skepticism, the crisis grew too dire to ignore. By the early 2000s, the government had begun to realize that fighting the desert required not just national willpower, but a new approach grounded in science, local adaptation, and relentless trial and error. The planners behind the Green Great Wall learned to listen to the land itself. In some regions, they abandoned thirsty monocultures in favor of native grasses and shrubs, which could survive in the harshest conditions and stabilize the dunes. Researchers experimented with new methods, such as the straw checkerboard technique, laying down grids of straw to hold the sand in place and trap moisture, giving fragile seedlings a fighting chance. The country invested in monitoring and technology, using satellites to track progress and identify failures, then adjusting strategies as needed. Even as critics laughed and foreign media lampooned the whole enterprise, China pressed on. Tree by tree, meter by meter, the battle was joined. Schoolchildren, soldiers, and farmers dug, planted, watered, and watched as the first hints of green began to appear on the horizon. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the tide began to turn. The sandstorms did not stop overnight, nor did the desert give up easily. But by the end of the first decade, something extraordinary was happening. Satellite images began to show patches of green where none had existed before. The world's most ambitious ecological engineering project was underway, and the outcome was no longer a foregone conclusion. So as the dust settled over another spring in the north, and as skeptical headlines continued to mock the dreamers trying to green the ungreenable, China's battle for its land pressed on. The fight was no longer just about trees, deserts, or statistics. It was about hope, resilience, and the possibility that, even in the face of seemingly impossible odds, human ingenuity could turn the tide. Would China's bold experiment hold back the sands, or would the world one day look back and say, "We told you so"? The answer was still buried in the shifting dunes, waiting to be uncovered by the passage of time. Seeds of doubt, laughter, failure, and the world's harshest critics. When China announced the 3 North Shelter Forest Program, later dubbed the Great Green Wall, to the world, the initial response outside its borders wasn't just skeptical, it was downright mocking. For decades, images of endless sand dunes and haunted abandoned villages were broadcast on Western news programs. Environmentalists, scientists, and armchair experts all seemed to agree. You could no more grow a forest in the Gobi than you could plant roses on the moon. Planting trees in sand? It sounded like something out of a children's fairy tale, not a state-led campaign mobilizing millions of people and billions of dollars. Headlines in major newspapers sneered, calling it a green theater, a symbolic project destined to die, or burying money in the sand. Cartoonists drew Chinese officials stooping under the sun, dropping seeds into barren wastelands, while the desert just swallowed them up again. If the rest of the world watched with a mix of amusement and condescension, some in China quietly wondered if the critics were right. For the planners and engineers tasked with making the Great Green Wall a reality, the mockery stung. But it wasn't new. China's history is a history of grand projects, many of which were met with global skepticism before becoming reality. But as planting began in earnest across thousands of kilometers, it quickly became clear that the world's doubts weren't baseless. In the late 1970s and 1980s, waves of volunteers, students, soldiers, farmers, entire communities were mobilized to dig holes, haul saplings, and carry water into places where it almost never rained. On paper, it sounded heroic, but on the ground, the work was brutal, and the results were mixed at best. Survival rates for new trees were abysmally low. In some years and regions, up to 85% of newly planted forests withered and died within months. In Inner Mongolia and parts of Xinjiang, entire lines of poplar, pine, and willow, species chosen for their fast growth, but not their drought resistance, became eerie forests of upright, sun-bleached skeletons. Chinese ecologists and local officials faced their own doubts. Some began to fear that they were fighting nature instead of working with it. The land was unforgiving, and the early campaign's emphasis on speed and numbers meant that too often, quantity won out over quality. Provincial leaders, desperate to meet central government quotas and win praise for their progress, cut corners or falsified survival data. In some cases, they simply dug up dead trees and planted new ones in their place, repeating the cycle with little hope of long-term success. International media pounced on these failures. Foreign correspondents flew in to film lines of dead saplings, broadcast exposés on China's folly, and interview Western scientists who warned that monocultures would doom the project from the start. "You can't turn a desert into a forest just because you want to," one American botanist declared. That's not how ecosystems work. But it wasn't just outsiders who doubted the project. Within China, a chorus of criticism grew louder. Local villagers, often required by law to participate in tree planting campaigns, grumbled about lost time and wasted resources. Some secretly resented being forced to plant trees that were doomed to fail, especially when water was scarce and every drop mattered for their crops. Environmentalists inside China began to publish studies showing that poorly planned afforestation could backfire, draining precious groundwater and sometimes making the land even less habitable. They pointed out that many of the trees being planted were non-native, fast-growing species that needed more water than the region could provide. There were warnings that an overemphasis on planting trees, without paying attention to soil health, local vegetation, or sustainable land management, could create new problems, not solve old ones. For a time, these criticisms seemed justified. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, large areas of China's Great Green Wall looked more like graveyards than forests. Desertification actually accelerated in some places, as overgrazing, overfarming, and population pressure continued to degrade the land. Even as officials reported record numbers of trees planted, sandstorms still raged, swallowing new highways and turning the sky brown in Beijing, Tianjin, and dozens of cities beyond. It looked like the world had been right to laugh, and some Western commentators reveled in every setback, framing China's struggles as proof that top-down, centrally planned mega-missions were doomed to fail in the face of nature's complexity. And yet, behind the headlines, something different was happening. China, faced with these very public failures and humiliations, didn't scrap the Great Green Wall. Instead, planners and scientists began to adapt. They listened to local experience. In remote corners of Inner Mongolia, they watched as villagers used straw, not just as fodder or fuel, but as a tool for survival. Some communities had discovered that by laying down rice straw in a checkerboard grid, 1 meter by 1 meter, they could stabilize the sand and slow the wind, buying time for native grasses and hardy shrubs to take root. This simple but ingenious method was quickly recognized as a breakthrough. When the wind blew, the straw grid kept the surface sand from moving, reducing evaporation and allowing precious moisture to stay put. It was labor-intensive, but unlike rows of doomed saplings, it actually worked. The desert didn't turn green overnight, but the sand stopped moving. That alone was a victory. Other lessons came from hard-won experience. Engineers and foresters realized that monocultures were a dead end. Diversity was the only path forward. Local species, like saxaul, tamarisk, and wolfberry, could survive brutal droughts and anchor the dunes far better than imported poplar or pine. Scientists began experimenting with soil additives, clay, compost, even special water-retaining polymers to give seedlings a fighting chance in the hostile sand. In some areas, drip irrigation was deployed, targeting roots directly to maximize survival with minimal water. A new generation of desert botanists, inspired by traditional ecological knowledge and armed with satellite data, started mapping where different approaches worked and where they didn't. The goal was no longer just to plant trees, but to build entire ecosystems, balancing forests, grasslands, and even desert-adapted crops. As the campaign entered the 1990s and early 2000s, the project evolved yet again. Instead of demanding endless lines of trees, planners introduced mixed shelter belts, bands of hardy shrubs, grasses, and windbreaks, interspersed with stretches of checkerboard, stabilized sand. Remote sensing and GIS technology allowed authorities to monitor progress in real time, catch failures early, and adjust strategies before whole regions collapsed into dust. Schoolchildren and city dwellers still dug holes each March for National Tree Planting Day, but the overall approach became smarter and more nuanced. In some places, the government even abandoned certain efforts, letting nature reclaim marginal lands or shifting focus to soil health and water conservation. International mockery, meanwhile, began to soften, if only a little. As global attention shifted toward climate change, some scientists started to re-examine China's Green Wall as a grand experiment in land restoration. While failures still outnumbered successes in some years, the fact that the project endured was itself remarkable. No other nation had attempted anything at such a scale. The world watched as Chinese researchers published new studies, showing that even modest successes, patches of green on the march, could reduce dust storms and improve local livelihoods. Reports filtered out of Inner Mongolia, where reforestation slowed the advance of sand dunes, protected roads and railways, and even allowed some families to reclaim abandoned farmland. At the same time, China's battle for credibility on the world stage played out in these harsh, wind-scoured frontiers. The leadership realized that reversing desertification wasn't just an ecological necessity, it was a matter of national pride and legitimacy. Every time a Western expert declared the Green Great Wall a fiasco, every time a foreign news anchor showed dead trees as evidence of futility, the pressure to succeed only grew. Local officials redoubled their efforts, not just to hit quotas, but to prove that Chinese ingenuity could solve problems others declared unsolvable. Every small win, a stabilized dune, a thriving shelter belt, a sandstorm diverted from a city became a rallying point. But the question never went away. Was it really working, or was China just papering over the failures with good PR? Some of the toughest critics remained inside China itself. In the early 2010s, a landmark report from the Chinese Academy of Sciences sounded the alarm. Continued monoculture planting, aggressive irrigation, and poor species selection could create new environmental crises, from groundwater depletion to ecosystem collapse. The advice was sobering: slow down, rethink, and focus on local adaptation, not just grand gestures. It was a hard lesson for planners and politicians used to measuring success in hectares and kilometers, not biodiversity or long-term resilience. Yet, for all the back and forth, the Great Green Wall pressed forward. If the world expected China to quietly give up and walk away, they were mistaken. Instead, teams of scientists and engineers, many of them young, many the children or grandchildren of displaced farmers, redoubled their research and returned to the field. New technology such as drones, satellite imaging, remote monitoring was deployed to pinpoint trouble spots and fine-tune strategies. Community engagement became the norm rather than the exception. Local buy-in, incentives for sustainable land management, and grassroots participation made the difference between success and failure. Even those who had once doubted began to see results. Sandstorms, once a seasonal curse, became less frequent and less severe in the greenest regions. And yet, the laughter from abroad did not fully stop. Whenever a new setback made headlines, a failed plantation, a sandstorm that buried a railway, a drought that killed 500,000 saplings, critics gleefully declared the project a boondoggle. but inside China, a quiet determination had taken hold. Each setback was met not with despair, but with innovation. New methods, new plants, new ways of thinking. The Green Great Wall became not just a line of trees, but a living laboratory, a sprawling, ever-evolving experiment in ecological restoration. What if, against all odds, this crazy scheme actually worked? What if the world's harshest critics would one day eat their words? The answer, as the decade wore on, would not be found in headlines or speeches, but in the slow, patient march of green across the sand. When the desert bloomed. A decade after critics first jeered and experts dismissed the dream, the deserts of northern China began to look very different. It did not happen overnight. There was no single moment when the world stopped laughing and started paying attention. Instead, the change unfolded like a slow sunrise. The first signs came from the sky. In spring, satellite images captured faint lines of green creeping across the Gobi's Golden Sea, ribbons of vegetation winding through the Taklamakan, checkerboard patterns holding fast against relentless winds. For locals living on the desert's edge, these were more than just abstract colors on a map. They were proof that life could claw its way back from the brink. Stories began to trickle out from places long written off as lost. In Inner Mongolia, elders who remembered dust storms blotting out the sun now spoke of clear blue skies. Schools no longer closed for sand days. Railways once choked by drifting dunes now ran on schedule, protected by vegetation belts, gravel barriers, and the stubborn grip of straw checkerboards. In villages that had once watched neighbors abandon homes and fields, families now tended small orchards of goji berries and hardy grapes, earning new livelihoods from land that once produced nothing but hardship. In some counties, the local government offered incentives for cultivating desert herbs, transforming previously lifeless zones into unlikely centers of sustainable agriculture. What shocked many observers was the speed at which these changes started to add up. According to Chinese forestry data, by 2024, more than 30 million hectares of land, an area larger than the entire United Kingdom, had been reforested since the project's inception. The nation's overall forest coverage, once hovering at a dismal 10% after decades of deforestation, now exceeded 25%. This was not simply a matter of planting trees. The project had grown into an exercise in restoring entire ecosystems, balancing forests, shrublands, grass corridors, and the careful use of water resources. In one stretch along the edges of the Taklamakan, scientists measured sand movement and found that dunes stabilized by straw grids and native plantings saw sand loss reduced by 99%. That was not just a local victory. It was a lifeline for communities and infrastructure hundreds of kilometers away. The visual impact was stunning, but so was the economic turnaround. Once marginal or abandoned land began to support tourism, agriculture, and new industries. Travelers flocked to Inner Mongolia to see the desert forests, marvel at sand-stabilized highways, and photograph vibrant green belts running parallel to ancient Silk Road routes. Local economies adapted. Farmers who once struggled with failed crops now exported desert-grown herbs and berries across China and beyond. In regions hit hardest by sandstorms in the past, air quality improved dramatically, public health crises eased, and the constant fear of ecological disaster faded into memory. The same villages that had been evacuated a decade before now welcomed back former residents, some of whom returned to find their childhood homes encircled by thriving shelter belts and living proof that the desert could, with enough patience, be pushed back. For years, foreign media had been quick to publish photos of dead saplings and dust-choked roads, gleefully predicting disaster. Now, the story changed. International organizations, such as the United Nations Environment Programme, began to highlight China's model in reports on large-scale ecological restoration. NASA satellite data showed that from 2000 to 2017, global green cover increased, and China accounted for more than a quarter of that growth, most of it in regions once written off as hopeless. The world, it turned out, had been too quick to laugh. Even in countries that once pointed to China's failures as cautionary tales, officials and scientists started taking notes. Delegations from Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia traveled to China to learn about straw checkerboards, community tree planting festivals, and the hybrid approach of blending tradition with advanced technology. The transformation was not just environmental, it was cultural and political. For many Chinese, the Green Great Wall became a symbol of resilience, a visible sign that national unity, innovation, and perseverance could overcome even the harshest odds. Social media, once filled with cynical jokes about burying money in the sand, now buzzed with pride. Photos of blooming sand dunes, green corridors snaking through yellow wastes, and local children playing in shade where their grandparents had known only wind and sun all went viral. As one viral post put it, "They said it was impossible. Look at it now. Only in China can a desert bloom like this." What was perhaps most unexpected was how the lessons of China's great experiment rippled outward. The very techniques that had been mocked, straw checkerboards, the use of native shrubs, and community-driven planting efforts began to appear in ecological projects from Senegal to Saudi Arabia. China's engineers and botanists were invited to advise on Africa's Great Green Wall Initiative, a transcontinental project inspired in part by what had happened in the Gobi and Taklamakan. Countries that once criticized China for throwing money at the desert now asked for blueprints, guidance, and technical support. Even stubborn international skeptics were forced to admit that, while China's model was not perfect, it had achieved results at a scale and speed rarely seen in the history of land restoration. Of course, the story was never as simple as China won, the critics lost. The project faced ongoing challenges. Not every area flourished. Monoculture forests remained vulnerable to pests, drought, and climate change. Scientists continued to warn against complacency, urging constant adaptation and a focus on biodiversity. Some regions struggled with water scarcity, and there were new debates over balancing economic growth with environmental health. Yet the central lesson endured. What the world once declared impossible was only improbable, and improbability can be overcome with enough patience, flexibility, and a willingness to learn from failure. In fact, failure became a central feature of the project's evolution, each setback fueling new ideas and new breakthroughs. By 2024, those who had once dismissed China's burying millions of plants in the desert as folly were forced to confront a different reality. The deserts had not been conquered outright, but their advance had been stopped, and in some places reversed. Lives once shaped by loss and retreat now saw hope, renewal, and even prosperity. China's gamble, so widely ridiculed at the start, became a model of ecological resilience and national determination. It was proof that no crisis is truly insurmountable, that sometimes the wildest dreams greening the world's largest deserts are not the ones that should be laughed at, but the ones that demand our respect. What other impossible challenges, environmental or otherwise, still lie ahead? If a country can turn sand into forest, how might these lessons be applied to the problems facing the rest of the world? Climate change, food security, sustainable development. As the sand receded and the forests advanced, China's Great Green Wall stood not only as a barrier against the desert, but as a living reminder that sometimes you have to keep working while the whole world laughs. Because in the end, it is not the critics who decide what can or cannot grow, but the ones who keep planting, even when the odds are stacked against them. That's the story of how the world's biggest environmental gamble became one of its most surprising victories. What started as a punchline grew into a model for ecological hope. So next time you hear someone laugh at an impossible idea, just remember the desert might be laughing too. But maybe, just maybe, it's about to get a lot greener. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and remember, sometimes the world's best comebacks start with a single stubborn seed.